Hello and welcome to the latest Bottom Line podcast here on the Blood Red channel. Myself, Matt Addison, alongside the Echo's business of football writer Dave Powell. Dave, I hope you're well. We've got loads to get into with RedBird AC Milan takeover, Liverpool overtaking Manchester United potentially in terms of revenues. I mean, it's been a busy start to the season for those of us covering the Reds on the pitch, but it sounds like it has been for you as well.
Yeah, the publishing of the off the pitch report, which we'll talk about a little bit later, kind of alludes to, well, it forecasts the revenues from the financial accounts for football clubs for the 2021-22 period. So that's been some interesting reading over the past couple of days. We've had the RedBird acquisition of AC Milan, which has rumbled on over the summer, as well as a myriad other things, such as the FSG have had to deal with, such as a perceived lack of transfer spend, Mo Salah's contract, etc., etc. So in terms of on the football side, it's not been, it's started off fairly explosively. I mean, as we record this, Thomas Tuchel's been sacked. We're 6 games into a season, so it's already delightfully bonkers. But yeah, the off the pitch things haven't been quiet either. So there's plenty to discuss.
Yeah, I'm sure if you were doing this job as a Chelsea reporter, it would be a very interesting period, shall we say? But let's start with the AC Milan takeover and all of that kind of thing around RedBird. And I suppose the obvious place to start really is to explain for anyone who doesn't know, why is it Liverpool should be sort of taking a look at this? Why is it we're talking about it on this particular podcast? What's the link with the Reds?
Well, we've covered the RedBird deal since it first arrived in terms of a special purchase acquisition company which called Red Bull, which had Billy Bean involved. The idea behind that was potentially to acquire a slice of FSG, FSG of the whole, not particularly Liverpool, for around 25% of that, maybe looking at taking it onto the stock market. That was kicked into the long grass back end of 2020, early 2021. But RedBird and its founder and managing partner, Gerry Cardinale, remained at the table to talk with FSG, and then they ended up concluding a $750 million investment into FSG's empire in March of 2021. So what that did, it gave FSG, during the difficult financial implications of the pandemic, a capital injection to be able to. It was never going to be used. I know people would have liked it to be used for for transfer spend, etc. But that's not how private equity works. It's there to provide cash flow into a business to allow them to continue their plans for growth. So one of the biggest things about that was buying the Pittsburgh Penguins. It also emboldened FSG to be able to push ahead with Anfield Road, etc., through having more confidence to provide the intercompany loans, etc. So all these things have been able to move ahead. They've built a new music concert in arena in Boston, just adjacent to Fenway Park. So loads of different things have happened as a result of this. RedBird own 11% of FSG. Some suggestion that made to me that they may, in the future, increase their stake in the company, but that's certainly not something which is in the here and now or immediate future. But what they are doing is they've made significant strides into the football industry through ownership of Toulouse, and they acquired AC Milan this summer. And they are the reason FSG partnered with them, and why it's interesting to Liverpool, is that they are seen as at the vanguard of kind of sports investment. Globally, they have a real kind of excellent set of skills. I mean, FSG bringing them in was designed really to get a capital injection, a significant one during COVID, but also to tap into their expertise and mine their knowledge in other areas of trying to grow the business. Which ultimately, while it seems like a really long-winded way of getting to Liverpool, the strength of FSG ultimately underpins, helps Liverpool and their investment into what they can do with Liverpool. And obviously that's a very pertinent point at the moment, because people are understandably a bit disappointed with how the transfer window went. Net spend's been called into question again. I know that's something which rears its head every summer usually. But a strong FSG is, FSG would see as allowing for a better chance of a strong Liverpool.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, isn't it? The kind of relationships that they've struck up, the way that this will work. You mentioned Toulouse there as well, part of that sort of wider group. I mean, is there a potential for there to be a kind of direct partnership? I suppose that would be more appealing to Liverpool in that it's Milan now, the champions of Italy, more so than possibly Toulouse, certainly from an outside perspective anyway. But I mean, is that a kind of realistic thing? How closely aligned are Liverpool and Milan allowed to be, given that this has taken place?
Well, there's no concern from UEFA's point of view, because FSG own a minority stake of 11% is not going to register for UEFA. But also, crucially, they don't have anyone from RedBird who sit on an administrative capacity at board level for Liverpool, which means they're not involved in direct decision making. They're there to provide capital and expertise for FSG to grow other facets of the business. I mean, another example is they concluded an investment into Spring Hill, which is LeBron James's and Maverick Carter's production company. So they own a stake of that. So along with Nike, RedBird, and Epic Games. So. But for in terms of a link up with Toulouse, the actual Toulouse purchase was done through it's kind of a subsidiary company of RedBird Capital Partners, which is called RedBird FC. I believe the RedBird the acquisition of AC Milan is done through RedBird Capital Partners itself. But there's a link there. I mean, you wonder whether a simpatico relationship, where there's ownership who are already aligned and they already have business interests together, there might be some benefits it could be, whether it's pre-season friendlies, whether it's sending the occasional player out on loan to get experience, but none of that is ever really been suggested. These two things operate completely independently of one another, because I think FSG have their own plans to create more of a multi-club network. I don't think you're going to see them move like City Football Group do, for instance, who've got, they're into 12, 13, 14 clubs that they own globally. But I do think the plan is further down the line for FSG to add more football teams across Europe, potentially Brazil, which has been mooted because there's a growing market in terms of media rights there. But there'll be no, it's a strange one because they are, when you look at it, they are very much at arm's length from each other. But Gerry Cardinale has been asked in the past whether he would be interested in acquiring Liverpool. He's never denied that would be a wonderful opportunity. But I think the AC Milan purchase changes the dynamic of things very much now because they've got their hands on a prized asset. But that's not to say that they won't continue to invest in FSG and grow their slice of that pie. Nor does it completely rule them out from taking, eventually being the owners of Liverpool. I mean, that's not the plan. It's not been discussed, but that that's never been removed from discussion. So, but for now and the long term plan that RedBird have is for Milan. It's not for Liverpool, but their plan is for FSG very much remaining the same.
You mentioned there the possibility of a kind of increase in the number of football clubs that FSG own and that kind of thing. You mentioned there as well about City, which I think is really interesting. We've seen them kind of benefit from that and lots of different ways in which that can be beneficial. It's something that's kind of been talked about for a little while. Is it just a case of FSG waiting for the right opportunity, do you think? Do you think that's why it's not happened yet? It's just that the right club hasn't become available to do that with?
I think they are working on the. I don't think football is their next move. It will be a move, but from what I'm told by people in the US, is that the next move will be an NBA team. That's what they want. That's what they're hoping for. The next move will be an NBA team, with my understanding being that they want the expansion franchise in Las Vegas. Which potentially could be. I mean, the NBA have tried to kick this can down the road a little bit in terms of saying that it's not immediately on the agenda because they want two more franchise. There's been talk of two more franchises in the NBA, one in Las Vegas, one in Seattle. I mean, Seattle used to have the Supersonics for decades, and they were a successful franchise, whereas Las Vegas has really seen a boom in sports investment over the past 2 years. I mean, they've had the Raiders go there, the Golden Knights, so they've got NFL team, NHL team there too, and NBA is the next logical step. I mean, there's already investment been made in terms of a 20,000 seater arena, which they're hoping to get up and running by the time, as soon as the NBA say yes, you can have an expansion franchise. But my understanding is that Las Vegas is what FSG want, and they want LeBron James to run it and be the. I mean, he's always talked about team ownership, and obviously he has a stake in FSG. So that seems like the most logical step. But following on from that, I think once they have a clear, defined timescale on when that may happen, I think they'll start to look at other ways that they can invest their money in terms of football. They won't be going after another prize asset like Liverpool. I mean, they've got one of the most lucrative global brands in football, not just in football, but in global sport in Liverpool. So the next move, you imagine they'll try and find something which works alongside that and is in some way beneficial to Liverpool. Europe's ripe for opportunity, but as I mentioned before, Brazil in particular, there is Brazil's seen as the kind of the home of football, I suppose, that real in terms of the beauty of it. But their domestic product hasn't been great, but attendances are strong, and there's more interest now in terms of media rights moving forward. So I think wherever the media rights will be strong, you'll see FSG place their marker. But as I mentioned, I think the first thing they're going to go for is an expansion franchise in the NBA.
Yeah, the Brazil thing could be interesting as well, I think, from a Brexit perspective in terms of trying to get players in from South America as well.
That's absolutely right, because we already seen there's been a bit of a Brazil connection at Liverpool, isn't there? You know, there's Addison, Fabinho, Claudio Taffarel, but then you've Firmino, so then you've got Marcelo Pitaluga joined to the youth ranks. So with Brexit causing such headaches, I mean, we see it this week with Diego Costa having his move held up to Wolves. It allows for Liverpool to potentially house some talent until such time they were able to get their necessary points to allow them to move over. So there is that potential. I think they like the way that maybe Leipzig does their business. I think if you were to look at a business model that they would follow, that they would look to emulate, it would be kind of what Leipzig do. So they bring, you look at the Salzburg, so they've got Liefering, Salzburg, and Leipzig, Salzburg, and Liefering, which sit in kind of a 3-club system where they go from Liefering to Salzburg to Leipzig. They're all independent of one another for legal purposes, but they all sing from the same hymn sheet. And you look at talent. I mean, look at the players that Liverpool have acquired from them, and Ibrahima Konate, Naby Keita. They were interested in Dominic Szoboszlai. So I think they would see it as it's almost a way to source talent through your own system. It's almost like a farm system like they have in Major League Baseball. So producing your own talent is the most cost-effective way of success. I mean, you see it with Trent Alexander-Arnold. They love a team of Trent Alexander-Arnolds because it's cost effective. But I think that'll be, if you were to think about how they were going to manage what a football club portfolio would look like, I think what Red Bull do is probably not too far wide of the mark.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? It'd be interesting to see what they do over the next few years in terms of that stuff. Just before we move on to the revenues and that stuff that we're going to talk about as well, just a last point really on the AC Milan thing. I noticed in the statement that they put out was the link with the New York Yankees, the baseball team. Obviously, the FSG link with baseball is obvious in the Red Sox as well. But there was mention of kind of a strategic partnership. Do you know sort of what that means, and is there a way that maybe Liverpool could look at something similar in the future, perhaps?
Well, it's quite. I think it's one of the most. It's really clever. I mean, there was a lot of headlines around LeBron James and Drake investing in AC Milan. I mean, in reality, they are investors in an investment fund that invested in AC Milan, which is a minority stake, so it's very small. But the link up with the Yankees comes through ownership of the Yankees, which is Yankee Global Enterprises. Now, Cardinale a lengthy relationship with the Yankees because he was, when he was at Goldman Sachs, he was an early investor in the Yes Network, and he was an advisor as well. So the Yes Network is effectively the major markets in the US have their own regional cable TV networks, where so the Yankees and Brooklyn Nets games, I think, are shown to the New York state or city area via the Yes Network and its app, and that's a huge audience. FSG actually own, so the Yankees are owners of the Yes Network, so they get all exclusive content, and they own the rights. Whereas FSG own Nesson, which is the kind of the Massachusetts Boston equivalent of the Yes Network. But what it means for AC Milan is that there may be a friendly Yankee Stadium, for example, next summer. That's something that's been suggested to me. But a key thing is that they want AC Milan, Cardinale and RedBird want to project AC Milan to a broader US audience, and they've managed to get them on the programming schedule for the Yes Network. So there'll be a magazine show, highlights packages available to a New York audience just on AC Milan content, and that's really clever way of making, of taking investment and making it work for you. So how that relates to Liverpool, you wonder whether there will be opportunities for Liverpool to seek something similar as the RedBird kind of link grows, because America is now it's always been the market which everyone wants to try and crack. I mean, music artists always try and crack America, and now it's the same for football, and European football wants to break America, and that's heading in the right direction now, because the World Cup in '94 kind of was the lightning rod, I suppose, which kick-started the MLS. But since then, it's been slow growth. So the most watched domestic league in America is the Mexican League, or MX, but that's largely because there's a large Spanish-speaking Hispanic population in America who love their football. The Premier League second, MLS third. So European football wants to tap into that now. With the World Cup coming in 2026, more prominent US players, managers over here in the UK, Jesse Marsh, Brendan Aronson, players like that, Pulisic. There is people. It seems like it's ripe for opportunity now. Liverpool have made significant strides there in recent years, and they'll look at, they'll be looking at, I'm sure, at that Yes Network link up and thinking they'd like to try and find a way to get exclusive Liverpool programming to an audience of millions every single week in America in some way, shape, or form that doesn't, away from the Premier League. But obviously with Premier League rights, they are, the highlights packages, etc., are all sold for $2 billion, the latest round of that. So it's an expensive do. So finding a way to grow their audience for Premier League sides is harder than it is for Serie A sides. So RedBird have been quick to tap into that market.
Yeah, certainly something to watch out for, I think, in the future as we see how these partnerships start to develop. But let's move on to the other big topic that we wanted to get into today. Obviously, Manchester United, Liverpool battles on and off the pitch, no sort of stranger to those sorts of things. But I noticed you wrote a piece earlier in the week around sort of Liverpool being predicted, at least by a fairly accurate model, to have moved above Manchester United in terms of the revenues. What's the details on this one, and kind of what's the kind of breakdown on it? Why is it important to FSG, I suppose, as much as Liverpool?
These are forecast results, but the last time off the pitch did them was in 2019, pre-COVID, and they were more than 95% accurate, I think, in terms of what the actual accounts were. So they won't be too far off, but it suggests a pre-tax profit of 76 million, which would be a club record. Same for turnovers of 602 million. Now, a lot of that is attributed to matchday revenue returning, of course. I think during last year's accounts, which is 2020-21, it took into account a season played behind closed doors, which meant Liverpool took in less than 4 million because fans were allowed back for a very small section of games, weren't they, at Anfield that season. But the matchday revenues have returned to like 90 million close on for Liverpool now. In last season's accounts, taking into account the fact that it was 38 Premier League games, was gosh knows how many games at Anfield in the Champions League. I mean, they going deep in European competition, even domestic competition, while the prize money's limited. You're getting full houses at Anfield, whether or not usually, whether if it's Carlisle United or whether it's in the Carabao Cup or whether it's at Real Madrid at home in the Champions League. There's going to be plenty of people there. So that's improved. Commercial revenues have significantly improved. Number of new deals signed. We'll also see the first knock into the Nike deal in its true form, I think. How that's obviously that deal's 30 million guaranteed, but then it's 20% of the of cost from the sale of Liverpool and Nike merchandise globally gets kicked back to Liverpool, so that could be lucrative. And broadcasting rights as well have increased because Liverpool featured more times on the telly. Same for, but prize money was a big factor in Liverpool. Likely to see big rises next year is because they made more than 100 million, I think, from the Champions League through prize money, TV money. And when you take into account everything else around that, that's a huge amount. Domestic cup competition was, I think for winning the FA Cup and the Carabao Cup, you're talking about 6 million for the two. But finishing second in the Premier League means they get 5 million more than who finished third. So all these things take into account for a successful season. And when compared to United, who've had their struggles on the pitch, they've not been going deep into European competition. They've not performed well in the league, and they've had outlay on players has been far more than what they're getting in. All this makes for the two teams passing each other in terms of revenues, which was always the trajectory had been there for a while. Liverpool have been really good at leveraging their success on the pitch, but you do fit. I mean, United have actually done quite well in terms of hanging in and how good their revenues have been for a number of years, despite the fact that they've been poor competitively. But Liverpool are far more closely aligned, I think, in terms of their competitiveness on the field, and their revenues are still very much they're very much closely aligned. So it's imperative really that Liverpool keep their foot on the accelerator and making strides in Europe and at home, because that's still very, very much key to them being having a successful business model.
With that in mind, then, I'm sure when you say a pre-tax profit of 76 million, the immediate question from a lot of Liverpool fans will be, well, why wasn't that money spent in the transfer market to make sure that this continues in future? But is it that simple? Is it a case of that being the case, and almost you do have to invest a little bit to get the continuation of this in the future? Or what do you think that the kind of thought process was in terms of that this summer?
If you're asking me the question if they could afford it to go out and sign Jude Bellingham, then yes, they could. They could, they are a club that has more financial fair play wriggle room than anyone in Europe, I'd argue, or most teams in Europe. However, there's a long-held strategy at Liverpool where it's not always, player sales underpinning what happens in the transfer market, but that has been a big part of it. The salary negotiation comes into play this coming season, so the wage will rise. Disposals of player registrations next summer, pardon me, we'll see. Like Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, the likes, the question marks over Naby Keita. They haven't got the assets to sell so much next summer. They will feel that they've already outlaid money on Darwin Núñez. While we can look at net spend, etc., they will look at that as an investment, when in reality, obviously, they've moved to replace Sadio Mane, etc. But it's going to be expensive for them next summer. It's not. I mean, baseball operates. Obviously, they have the Red Sox. Baseball operates on a system where a bad season the reset button can almost be hit the following year. Obviously, you have payroll obligations which you have to manage, but the competitiveness gets reset every year. So, that doesn't affect your revenues to the degree it does if you miss out on the top four in the Premier League. So, in order for them to, we've got the problem of the aging squad that people point to about Henderson, Milner, etc. They're going to have to invest serious money next year, and they're not going to be able to get that back. People were arguing whether they could do it this year, but they're obviously factoring in a number of things here to try and spread the cost over a longer period of time. Could they have afforded it? Yes, they could have, but they are maintaining their stance of being a sustainable business that operates within the realms of what it earns. They spend what they earn, and they don't take money out of the business. They never have, and they are financing infrastructure development, which has raised revenues. But there's no real getting away from the fact they're going to have to spend next summer considerable amount to address some issues, which probably valid. There are valid reasons, valid concerns from fans as to why they weren't really addressed this summer, and kind of the backpedaling to try and get Artemelo in so late on a loan kind of points to the fact that they probably missed the boat in terms of adding. I mean, they wanted Tchouaméni as well. Would Tchouaméni have come in the same window as Núñez? Yes, probably. But again, it's the same. Liverpool's model has always been they have a strategy. They have a list of players they want. To get someone like Bellingham so late in the transfer window from Dortmund, who have already lost Haaland, they would have been asking, huge sums of money, which sets a precedent in the transfer market then for Liverpool. So you're almost trying to keep up appearances of being shrewd negotiators and tough negotiators and getting players for the right prices at the same time as addressing needs on the pitch. So, they could have made additions this summer. They didn't. They're going to have to next summer. The money will be there.
Let's just finish up then with the sort of contracts and wages. You mentioned those before. Obviously, the big one this summer was Mohamed Salah, and that finally got done. That was a huge thing for Liverpool to do. But I suppose at the same time as that, you'd look at, say, the Sadio Mane sale. They've replaced Sadio Mane with a player who is on far less money in Darwin Núñez, probably maybe even sort of 25-30% of what it would have been to give Sadio Mane a new contract. Is the wage bill not a problem, but it's obviously growing? Is that something that had to be considered as well this summer, that it wasn't just an investment in Darwin Núñez, it was also kind of almost saving a bit of money on the wages, if not in the transfer fee?
As long as revenues continue to rise, they won't be concerned about wage bill payroll increasing year on year, because that just tends to happen. I mean, if you look at the increase of Liverpool's payroll since FSG took over, it's increased by something like 200 million. It's an enormous rise. But there's a lot of bonus related, etc. So the wage bill we saw was considerably high. Year before last was down to bonus payments paid for the Champions League, etc. So take that out, it's a bit cheaper. Obviously, they're happy to pay bigger wage bills if it's bonus related, because it means the team's achieved success, and that's delivered higher revenues anyway. But I don't think wage bill is some. I think they stand underneath the 70% recommended threshold of that. Consider, I think they're 65, 66%, which is well below. I mean, some teams are operating in the 90s. Leicester, I think, are operating at more than 100% of their revenues are, going towards wages, which is just unsustainable by any stretch of the imagination. It's not being, there is no value in that for what they're doing at the moment. So there's room for growth there. Obviously, I think the Salah renegotiation, they had to factor in. It's going to be a considerable rise for him, but there is room for growth for wages for a big addition, or more than one big addition to come. It's about, I suppose the biggest question for them is whether they find the right people. And I suppose a lot of that comes to, Jurgen Klopp has a good relationship with Mike Gordon, who's FSG's man on the ground at Liverpool, has been since he took over. He's the man that really directs the FSG strategy at Liverpool. So you do wonder, I think those two are still, closely aligned, I believe. So it's, I think next summer's going to be really interesting. I know everyone calls Liverpool kind of next summer FC, and I understand that entirely. I think last summer we were talking about this summer being the summer where they'll do something. But there is money there for them to spend, and I don't think they'll be too considered about a wage bill rise. If anything, they've positioned themselves quite well to go at the market next summer. I mean, you only have to look at Chelsea this summer. Todd Burley and Clearlake have come in and they've spent 270 million plus. They're 6 games into a season, and the manager that they were talking about giving a new contract to last month has now been sacked. Probably going to have to pay him 14 million in compensation. So that's almost 300 million out the door this summer. I know they got some money back through player sales, but they are now having to hire a new man to try and deliver success, and you start the cycle again. So Liverpool obviously have Klopp in situ. They have that new contract. They have some strategic positioning there. The key thing is that they have to get the recruitment right again in a big way moving forward, whether that's January, whether it's next summer, because they can't afford to slip up or fall away here.
Yeah, they had that big summer, didn't they, in 2018, partially funded, of course, by the sale of Felipe Coutinho, but it sort of feels like they're going to have another summer a bit like that, but without the Coutinho sale to fund it. So, like we said, it could be an interesting one in 2023. But I think that's just about all we've got time for. Thank you to Dave for coming on and giving us his insight. Make sure to check out Dave's writing on the Echo around all the financial elements of the Reds, and we'll have another edition of this show for you very soon. For now, though, thank you for listening, and goodbye for now.